January 1812. On the frozen ground before an enemy-held fortress, thousands of redcoats waited in silence. Their breath hung in the night air, muskets gripped tight, eyes fixed on the towering walls. At the very front, the Forlorn Hope, volunteers who knew they would almost certainly die, prepared to lead the way. In the darkness, time seemed to stop. Then, a signal. The silence would shatter into fire, steel, and chaos. This is the story of the storming of Ciudad Rodrigo. After years of brutal fighting across the Iberian Peninsula of Spain and Portugal, forces under the command of Sir Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, had been driven back towards Lisbon and now lay trapped between the Atlantic Ocean and the River Tagus. Or so it seemed. In fact, that move had long been planned, and the trap, if there was one, lay in wait for the French. Over months and in complete secrecy, tens of thousands of men had been employed digging massive defensive works on the high ground guarding the approaches to Portugal's capital. The lines of Torres Vedras, as they were known, consisted of an incredible 152 military works in two distinct bands running from coast to river, manned by 29,000 men and 247 heavy cannon. They effectively formed an impenetrable barrier for French advance. Not only that, but in withdrawing here, Wellington had ordered a scorched earth policy, stripping the land of buildings, crops, cattle and people, meaning that when a huge French army under Marshal André Masséna arrived in front of them that October, it had no way of sustaining itself. Over the course of that bitter winter, the French army in this region effectively starved, with horses and men dying in their thousands, until, with supplies and troops utterly exhausted, Masséna was forced to withdraw back to the main supply bases on the Spanish-Portuguese border. Finally, the tables were turned, and Wellington, for the first time in quite some time, could go on the offensive and begin his efforts to drive the French invaders from the Iberian Peninsula. The very first step in achieving that goal was capturing two major roads and the forts that protected them, known as the Keys to Spain. The southernmost and largest of the two lay right here in the south on a ring road running from the border right up to the Spanish capital of Madrid. Protecting it along the river Guadiana was the mighty fortress of Badajoz. But before Badajoz could be taken, the northern road running from the border to the key city of Salamanca had to be secured. That too was no easy task, as it was protected by a formidable fortress along the banks of the Agueda River named Ciudad Rodrigo. It's that fight that we'll follow in this video. Let's take a look at the city. By switching over to the drone, we can see just how imposing a task capturing it would be. Covering an area of 600 by 500 meters, the main town at the time was mostly enclosed within these substantial and scientifically designed defences. Perched on high ground with guns overlooking this medieval bridge crossing the Agueda, it was in perfect position to defend against attack from the west. Around the entire perimeter were found heavily built and up to 10-meter high walls, each protected by earth banks and ditches designed to impede any attacker and create a killing ground for enfilade fire delivered by the fort's 153 cannon. Outside the main fortress was at the time a further series of defences based on a number of fortified stone convents, with the Santa Cruz here to the north acting as a lone outpost, and then the San Francisco and Santo Domingo, which were joined by a further curtain wall, no longer existing but which ran through this section of the modern town. All told, Ciudad Rodrigo, under the command of General de Brigade Barry, was garrisoned by some 2,000 men, mostly from the 34th Léger and the 113th Régiment de Ligne, along with several companies of artillerymen, who in point of fact were too few to man all of the fortress's guns at one time. When Wellington's forces arrived here in the unusual campaigning month of January, and having crossed the Agueda further upriver, he and his chief engineer, Colonel Fletcher, surveyed the ground. They identified this location as the one which offered the best chance of success. Known as the Greater Tesson, it was a ridge of high ground located around 700 meters north-northwest of the outer city walls, and importantly at about the same elevation as the fortress itself. In some ways, it wasn't a great surprise that Wellington chose this area. In fact, when the fortress had been captured by the French earlier in the war, it was here that they had placed their own siege batteries to batter the city walls, and had since installed a small redoubt just here on the hill to prevent it being used again for the same purpose. Let's switch back to the drone and overfly the area. Leaving from the Greater Tayson and heading towards Ciudad Rodrigo, we approach a lower hill, today crowned with modern buildings, which at the time was a bare knoll known as the Lesser Tayson. Then we cross open ground before reaching the sloping earthworks heading up towards the northwest corner of the fortress. Note here the unusual shape of this corner of the fortress earthworks and the repaired section of wall with grassy bank above it. This would be the site of the main breach. We also get a better look at the defences here, including the double ditch which had to be scaled in the face of point-blank cannon fire. In short, Ciudad Rodrigo will be a very tough nut to crack. In order to crack that particular nut though, Wellington had around 10,000 men, predominantly from two divisions. First was the Fighting Third, led by General Thomas Picton, one of Wellington's most experienced commanders. With his two brigades were some of Britain's finest fighting troops, including the 45th Foot, men from Nottinghamshire, the 5th Battalion of the 60th Foot, and the 1st of the 88th, the Connaught Rangers. Famously ill-disciplined when behind the lines, they were true fighting men with an unmatched reputation in attack. Amongst them in the fight to come was young Lieutenant William Grattan, whose accounts of the siege provide a fascinating insight into what it was like on the ground. Wellington's second main force was also a good one, the Light Division. Commanded by the ruthless yet charismatic Black Bob Crawford, it included 3 battalions of the famed 95th Rifles. Wearing bottle green tunics rather than the traditional scarlet redcoats, these men were armed with the excellent Baker rifle and were amongst the finest troops in the British Army. One such man was George Simmons, who like Grattan would offer a valuable insight into the battle to come. Rounding out Wellington's assault force were Generals Pack and Power's Portuguese brigades and Colonel Brian O'Toole's detachment of the 83rd Foot's Light Company and the 2nd Portuguese Caçadores. In order to breach Ciudad Rodrigo's defences, Wellington had amassed 32 heavy siege guns, throwing iron shot that would methodically chip away at the city's defences. In order to begin that siege, Wellington's men first had to clear the French earthwork redoubt on top of the Greater Tayson, the footprint of which can still be seen on the ground more than 200 years later. That job was accomplished by 900 men of the Light Division on the nights of the 8th 9th of January in less than 20 minutes, with the 55 defenders who had hoped to hold up the Allies for 5 days being quickly overwhelmed. In fact, time generally is a key factor here. Moving in January, an almost unknown time to campaign due to the very harsh weather, Wellington had hoped to capture Ciudad Rodrigo before larger French forces in their cantonments further into Spain could react and break the siege. Knowing that this was a very real possibility, everything had to be done as quickly as possible. With the Greater Tayson in their hands, Wellington's men immediately began digging the trenches required for Napoleonic siege warfare. Let's take a look at the mechanics. Obviously, in this situation, Wellington couldn't just roll his guns up to the top of the Tayson and start blazing away at the city walls. That would just get a lot of people killed. So instead, he had to start with entrenchments. By digging an approach trench into the reverse slope of the hill and then slowly sapping forward, his men could advance, largely protected from enemy fire, until they reached about this spot. From there, a parallel would be put in at 90 degrees, along which troops could move freely. Once that was established, breaching batteries could be installed, with the guns protected by gabions, wicker baskets filled with earth. When in place and enough powder and shot had been brought up, those guns could be unmasked and begin firing at the fortress walls. It goes without saying, digging in those trenches on rocky ground at night in early January with enemy cannon firing all the time was deeply unpopular, as William Grattan remembered.
In some instances, the soil was so unfavourable, it was next to an impossibility to make headway against it. Instead of clay or gravel, we frequently met with a vein of rock, and invariably, when this occurred, our losses were severe, for the pickaxes coming into contact with the stone caused a fire to issue that plainly told the enemy where we were, and as a matter of course, they redoubled their efforts on these points.
With a bit of new technology in the form of LiDAR scans, we can actually still see the ghosts of those trench works, dug 2 centuries ago across the Greater Tayson, which offers a fascinating glimpse into that moment in history. With preparations continuing, the Anglo-Portuguese made their next move. Late on the 13th of January, the men of the King's German Legion stormed the fortified Santa Cruz convent, which stood here under this modern bullfighting ring, thus securing the flank for the ongoing trench works. Of course, whilst all this digging was going on, the French weren't just sitting there waiting to be beaten, they had their own cards to play. The very next evening, the 14th, some 500 men, a quarter of the entire garrison, sallied out and unexpectedly attacked the newly captured Santa Cruz convent, briefly driving the British back, destroying some of their positions and filling in trench works before themselves being forced back to the safety of the city. Let's move down onto those city walls to get a French gunner's perspective. At 4 PM on the 14th, the British began flinging the first of more than 9,000 18 and 24-pounder cannonballs at this position, smashing much of it apart and slowly crumbling the walls here into the ditch below. Many of those shot, bouncing off the earth slope to the front, skipped over the walls and slammed into the face of the nearby church, which today, complete with this incredible damage from the siege, gives just some idea of how ferocious that fire was. As the breaching batteries fired on at two main breaching points, one on this corner and a smaller one here in this spot on the eastern wall, the digging continued, with infantry sapping closer to the enemy walls in a zigzag pattern to avoid their shot travelling down a trench, with eventually a further parallel from which troops could cross a much shorter exposed area when launching their attack. When finally the main wall collapsed 5 days later, with the rubble falling into the ditch to its front, and upon the breach being deemed practicable, i.e. able to be scaled by infantry, the main assault could finally begin. Of course, the French had been busy too. Let's look at the area that is today the church square just behind the main breach. Here in the lower ground and safe from British guns, they'd created an inner defensive line. Before that, at the top of the main breach, they'd placed chevaux de frise, effectively a giant log with hundreds of sword blades sticking out of it, a kind of early barbed wire, designed to stop the attackers from progressing beyond the breach. If they did manage it though, further back in the square, about here, was a well-built and heavily manned barricade, lined with defenders and a cannon at either end loaded with deadly canister shot, all was aimed at the top of the breach to hammer the attackers if they broke in. By the 19th of January, all was set, and Wellington formed his troops to begin the assault on the two breaches of Ciudad Rodrigo, with the Light Division attacking the lesser breach just here, the 3rd Division the main breach, and then diversionary attacks to be made by Pack and O'Toole's troops here and here, the aim being to stretch the defenders thinly across the entire fortress perimeter. Shortly after dusk, troops began to make their move, with a storming party under Colonel McKinnon, made up of men of the 45th and 88th Regiments, creeping across this ground towards the main breach. Ahead of them, at the very tip of the spear, went the Forlorn Hope. Composed entirely of volunteers, few were expected to survive the night, their job being to spring any nasty surprises before the main attack arrived. Despite the awful prospect, many welcomed the chance to distinguish themselves with promotion, glory, and the best pickings of the town's loot as their reward, should they live long enough. George Simmons, an officer in the 95th Rifles, remembered that moment. The 3rd Division moved to attack the right breach, and the Light Division the left or small breach. The Forlorn Hope and the storming parties moved out at about 7 o'clock, and the head of the column followed close behind. A tremendous fire was opened upon us, and as our column was entering the ditch, a magazine on the ramparts by the large breach blew up and ignited a number of live shells, which also exploded and paid no sort of difference to friend or foe. The night was brilliantly illuminated for some moments, and everything was made visible. Then, as suddenly, came utter darkness, except for the flashes from cannon and muskets, which threw a momentary glare around. Just a few yards behind him was William Grattan.
In the attack of the Grand Breach, both parties greeted each other with a cheer, only to be understood by those who have been placed in a similar situation. Yet the enemy were in no way daunted by the shout raised by our soldiers. They crowded the breach and defended it with a bravery that would have made any but troops accustomed to conquer waver. But the fighting division were not the men to be easily turned from their purpose. The breach was speedily mounted, yet nevertheless a serious affray took place where it was gained. A considerable mass of infantry crowned its summit, while in the rear and at each side were stationed men so placed that they could render every assistance to their comrades at the breach without any great risk to themselves. And besides this, 2 guns of heavy calibre, separated from the breach by a ditch of considerable depth and width, enfiladed it, and as soon as the French infantry were forced from the summit, These guns opened their fire on our troops.
Those guns, hurling hundreds of musket balls with each discharge at less than 50 yards range, were the major danger for the attackers, now spilling over the breach into a nightmarish scene. Let's leave that main breach for a moment and move to the lesser breach. Located approximately here, where today a road runs and a tunnel exists, you can actually see the newer stone from the repairs made after the battle. And by switching to this modern night shot from the same location and panning along the line of the wall, it's easy to imagine the chaos here as French muskets poured shot down on the approaching attackers from the battlements. It was here that the Light Division were now swarming up the rubble slope, following their Forlorn Hope. Just behind the leading troops was Major General Crawford himself, who stood atop the glacis, encouraging his men into the attack until, struck in the chest by a musket ball which embedded in his lung, he fell gravely wounded. He would take 4 days to die and is today interred beneath the rubble of the lesser breach. For his men, the fight went on, and in a short but bloody scrap they forced the defenders back before breaking into the town, with troops now moving towards the sound of gunfire at the main breach to their right. Let's head back there and pick up the story. With those 2 French cannons still spitting death across this open square, the men of Connaught now sought to silence them in a bid to break the French defence, as William Grattan describes.
The French cannoneers, 5 in number, stood to and served their gun with as much sang-froid as if on a parade. But this was of no avail. Men going to storm a breach generally make up their minds that there is no great probability of their ever returning from it to tell their adventures to their friends, and whether they die at the bottom or the top of it, or at the muzzle or upon the breech of a cannon, is to them pretty nearly the same. The first who reached the top after the last discharge were 3 of the 88th. Sergeant Pat Brazel of the Grenadier Company called out to his 2 companions, Swan and Kelly, to unscrew their bayonets and follow him. The 3 men passed the trench in a moment and engaged the French cannoneers hand to hand. A terrific but short combat was the consequence. Swan was the first and was met by the 2 gunners on the right of the gun, but no way daunted he engaged them and plunged his bayonet into the breast of one. He was about to repeat the blow upon the other, but before he could disentangle the weapon from his bleeding adversary, the second Frenchman closed upon him and by a coup de sabre severed his left arm from his body a little above the elbow. Kelly, after having scrambled under the gun, rushed onward to secure his comrade. He bayoneted 2 Frenchmen on the spot, and at this instant Brazel came up. 3 of the 5 gunners lay lifeless, while Swan, resting against an ammunition chest, was bleeding to death.
With the guns silenced, the lesser breach now taken, and O'Toole's detachment making progress from the west, the French defence of Ciudad Rodrigo crumbled, and men, mad with the terror and the adrenaline of battle, swarmed into the town along these very streets, and an incredible display of courage under fire gave way to far more sinister scenes, as Grattan describes.
Plunder and blood was the order of the day, and many an officer on this night was compelled to show that he carried a sabre. Many of the soldiers, with their faces scorched by the explosion of the magazine at the Grand Breach, others with their lips blackened from biting off the ends of their cartridges, more covered with blood, and all looking ferocious, presented a combination sufficient to appall the stoutest heart. Scenes of the greatest outrage now took place, and it was pitiable to see groups of the inhabitants half naked in the streets, the females clinging to the officers for protection, while their respective houses were undergoing the strictest scrutiny. Some of the soldiers turned to the wine and spirit houses, where, having drunk sufficiently, they again sallied out in quest of more plunder. Others got so intoxicated that they lay in a helpless state in different parts of the town.
The outrages continued throughout the night, with many, including Spanish civilians, losing their lives in the chaos, which was only finally brought under control with the arrival of daylight on the 20th. A notable survivor of the carnage was General Barry, the French commander who surrendered his sword, and with it the few troops he had remaining in the town, bringing an end to the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo. Wellington himself, although pleased with the success, was outraged by the excesses that followed and swore that it would never happen again, a promise he could not keep. Once the dust had settled, the butcher's bill could be counted. All told, Allied losses throughout the siege were 9 officers and 186 men killed, with a further 70 officers and 846 men wounded, whilst the French, who performed well given their small numbers, lost over 500 men killed and wounded, and the remainder of the garrison taken prisoner. The casualties to the civilian population remain unknown to this day. With the siege over and one of the 2 keys to Spain in his hands, Wellington's push to liberate Spain would go on, as his men marched on to an even more brutal fight to follow at Badajoz. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out our deep dive into that following fight with our video right here on YouTube on the Siege of Badajoz. And if you find Napoleonic history interesting, be sure to check out our Patreon, where we have a whole series of exclusive virtual battlefield tours available, exploring many of the major actions of the period. That's all this time. See you again soon.